I'd like to call the special meeting of the Committee of the Whole to order at 5:32. Approval of the agenda. All in favor? Opposed? On to adoption of the minutes. Got a motion to adopt the minutes, or any comments with respect to changes to the minutes? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. On to old business and our Director of Finance.
Thank you. Because there can often be a lot of discussion at our budget meetings or Committee of the Whole meetings related to budget, we have tried to capture some of the requests from Council and bring them back in writing with some answers to your questions. So I believe most of them are fairly self-explanatory. In terms of the first one was a suggestion from Councillor Day that we reapply for the UBCM Regional Communities to Communities grant. And if you had any further questions, I know our Director of Planning is here this evening, but I know he's working on that. So, Councillor Day, did you have any further questions on that? Okay, thank you. There had been a question regarding, I think there had been an error in carrying forward the Economic Development Officer salaries, and we have made corrections, and that is what the forecast now looks like in item number 2. In answer to a question from Councillor Day about the educational plan, we basically have taken this right off the training budget, which is in the Planning Department tab of your workbook. And again, if Councillor Day had any further questions, we've basically tried to capture that from what was in the training budget. If you'd like a moment maybe to peruse that, Councillor Day. Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Item number 4 was a request from Councillor Nault for a breakdown of what constitutes our PILT revenue, and that's what you see there in item number 4. Any further questions?
Just one question. The amount shown here is 2.199 million. The budget originally showed 2.099 million.
Yes, that is correct. And we will be getting to an explanation of differences this evening, and that is one of the areas of difference.
Thank you.
I can give you the short answer, which is that I have increased the federal grants by 100,000. I felt I was extremely conservative in my estimates there. I had estimated 1.9 million, and we actually received 1.984, so almost 2 million last year. So I've increased that by 100,000, hence the difference. Over the page, Councillor Nault had requested a breakdown of overtime by...
Excuse me, Andrea.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just wanted to be clear that the Fortis Gas, does that include the new funding piece that they've just instituted?
No, that is not included in PILT. That's included in a different area of the budget.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
And breakdown of overtime showing, for your reference, 2014 budget, 2014 actual, and then the 2015 budget. And Councillor Nault, does that answer your questions?
Yes, that answers it quite nicely. I have an email from Pat on administration overtime and explanation that acting salaries were rolled into that overtime.
Right. Okay.
And I was wondering if the same thing applied to the planning overtime. It shows $20,000, I believe, over spending on 2014. Is that because of acting salaries rolled in?
No, not in... Planning budget was 20 and the actual was...
Finance shows a plan of 5 and a spent of 25.
Oh, okay. I thought you said the planning department.
Finance.
Okay, yes. Finance historically has been running. I'm not sure why they picked $5,000 as a budget number, to be honest. It has been, at this time of the year, we don't have a lot of control over our time and deadlines. It has been actually running at $25,000, and we believe we can trim it to $15,000 this year.
Thank you. That's all.
I also, on that topic though, did trim the RCMP budget from the $5,000 they had requested, because I wanted it to reflect the fact that we have authorized some additional staff there on the basis that that would help to reduce our overtime costs. So we will be monitoring that area closely. The request for the financial statements and budgets, I did speak briefly to Councillor Day before the meeting, and I believe, Councillor Nault, you may have been provided with some documents from the Pacific Family.
Thank you. I was provided with documents from Pacific Family. I'll be studying those. And
Okay, great. All right, so just to make sure that we don't miss some of those good questions that are raised.
Okay. Any questions from councillors or Cynthia?
Just a point, is there anyone else on council who would like the financial statements from Pacific Center Family Services Association? Because I just got them late this afternoon by email, but I can certainly share them with others if anyone else would like to look those over.
That'd be great. Thank
I'll
you.
forward them out.
Any other questions? Well, there being none, we'll move on to new business and a review, or I'm sorry, old business,
No, new business.
no, pardon me, new business, I was right, first time. Review of the sewer budget, Deputy Director of Finance.
Thank you. So the sewer budget that's before you, this is a summary of both the operating and the capital budget. And it is laid out consistent with the budget summary that you've been seeing. So first the revenues are listed, then the expenses, then the budget additions, and followed by the budget deductions. So I'll take you through each line, just high level. The color coding on this budget, the intent is to allow the reader to see what revenues and additions fund what expenses and deductions. And if you look right to the bottom of the budget, so on page 14, excuse me, you will see that the budget balances in its entirety. So starting with the parcel tax, the city levies a number of parcel taxes to recover the capital cost of the city's sewer system. You'll see that the budget in 2015 drops from the budget in 2014, and that's because one of our local area services that we refer to as Colwood Main, or the trunk of the sewer system, the debt related to that area was paid in full last year, so we no longer need to tax for that area. Looking forward in 2016 and future, that's when we anticipate starting the Colwood Central parcel tax levy to recover the capital costs of the Colwood Central area, which I'll get to a little bit later. We do have some capital works left to be done in that area. And then if we look right over to 2019, the parcel tax revenue does drop off, and that's because at that time both the Colwood West local area service and the Colwood South local area service will have been, the debt will have been retired, will have been paid in full. The next component of the sewer budget is the septic parcel tax. This is a levy that's levied on any property in Colwood that has a septic system. And it's direct recovery of one of the components of the CRD's annual requisition. The city has no control over this amount, and the levy is approximately $18 per household. The bulk of the sewer budget relates to the next line item, which is the sewer user fee. So the sewer user fee is levied to recover all annual ongoing maintenance and operating costs of the sewer system. And if you see the combined total of the user fee and the connection and the collection fees is $612,000 and change. And if you look to the next page there, that's the total of the sewer recurring operating expenses. Just to touch on the decrease in the budget from 2014 to 2015 sewer user fee budget, we haven't been spending the legal fee budget within this fund, so we have proposed cutting that legal fee budget right back. If we get to the next line, so this is a reference to note 4, any sewer enhancement fees or sewer expansion fees that the city collects, those fees are transferred directly to the sewer capital reserve and used to fund capital projects. So if we move down, the budget is showing recognition of some conditional revenue, gas tax, and a contribution of $50,000. These two pieces are the funding sources of 2 of the sewer capital projects, one being the sewage treatment that we've spoken about in the past, and the $50,000 is a contribution towards the Matilda sewer capital project.
Madam Chair, can I just ask a question on that?
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering about why there's gas tax revenue in this budget.
There's gas tax revenue because it's a funding source for one of the sewer capital projects. Specifically, yeah, I believe it's the sewer treatment capital project that was in the financial plan last year as well.
And can you just tell me what the actuarial adjustment reserve is, or revenue, sorry?
Certainly. The actuarial adjustment revenue, it's a non-cash transaction. Basically, anytime we receive debt from the MFA, we're liable for the full amount. Say it's $1 million. We don't actually receive cash in that full amount. They hold a portion back, about 1%. Over time, we're earning income on that, but we don't actually receive cash for that income. That said, from a financial reporting standpoint, we do have to recognize revenue. But from a budgetary standpoint, you really wouldn't see it included in your financial plan. Ultimately, when your debt is paid down in full, you pay a slightly lower amount than anticipated because of those earnings. But we exclude it from the financial plan because there's no cash impact.
Any further questions from committee? No. There being none? Mayor Hamilton?
Mine refers to the questions that one of our residents had sent in. Jen, have they all been answered? I know the last information I had was some had been answered.
The primary question there really relates to the surplus that the resident picked up on from 2014, which I would like to discuss, and we'll be getting into that shortly.
Okay, thank you.
So just moving to the next page, highlights the recurring operating expenses. These are all highlighted in blue, and these are funded by the sewer user fee. The primary item to note, a large component of our annual operating costs are requisitioned by the CRD. We have no control over these costs, and this is funding directly towards their operating costs. This also includes all the public works salaries and maintenance costs for the city's pump stations, costs of connecting residents, which are funded through the connection fees. We do include a $50,000 contingency in this budget. Moving down, the MFA debt interest is funded through the parcel tax revenue. And if we jump to the next page, we currently have no special projects planned for the sewer fund. Then as we get to the last page, you'll see a budgeted transfer from reserves of $117,000. This, combined with the budgeted $50,000 contribution, is the funding source for the Matilda sewer capital project. The $1 million debt proceeds and the $1.3 million debt proceeds in 2016. This is the anticipated cost of the remaining works required for the Colwood Central sewer area, and we do anticipate starting this work later this year. And then lastly, if we jump down to the transfers to reserves, currently the only budgeted transfer to reserve is the expected sewer enhancement fee revenue that we expect to collect. We then have the principal payment on the debt, which is funded through the LAS parcel tax revenue, and then the TCA expenditures, which the bulk of that budget is the central expansion. So if we go right to the bottom there, you'll see that the sewer fund generated a surplus of approximately $100,000 in 2014. Now, if you look to note 8, the surplus needs to be looked at by component, because, as we've mentioned, there's many different revenue streams within this budget. The surplus relating to the sewer user fees in 2014 was approximately $250,000. And the reason was twofold. One, the revenues came in slightly over budget, but also the actual expenses incurred in 2014 were substantially lower than budget. They were approximately $175,000 under budget. On this document, the sewer fee surplus is, basically artificially understated. So it doesn't show $250,000. It only shows $103,000. And that's because if you have a look on the sewer deductions, the principal payment on debt in 2014 was just over $650,000 on a budget of $500,000. And that's simply because one of the debt principal repayments that was funded in 2013 was made in 2014. So that's that budget to actual discrepancy there. So we are looking tonight for committee to make a recommendation on how staff should manage that surplus, whether it should be, do we create a sewer operating reserve fund? Do we use it to reduce the budgeted sewer user fee revenue going forward? I mean, the city and engineer and finance management, we have talked about a few methods, but we do want that surplus to be brought to everyone's attention because it was generated by the sewer user fee. And that really is the sewer budget in its entirety. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from committee members? Cynthia?
And just, can you tell me again about the surplus? I didn't quite follow when you were explaining note 8 about, it was something from 2013 that affected 2014, something about sewer debt, was it?
Certainly. So the sewer fund surplus or deficit, that bottom line on this budget, that's taking all revenues and additions, subtracting all expenses and deductions to give you that figure. In 2014, if you look under sewer deductions, the principal payment that we made on the sewer debt, it exceeded our budget by about $150,000. And that was simply because of a timing issue. The principal payment that we intended to make in December of 2013 wasn't actually made until January of 2014. So that right there is throwing the surplus off. If that had been made in 2013, your surplus would show as closer to $250,000, which is the surplus that was generated by the sewer user fee last year.
Any further questions? No? Is there a recommendation coming from committee? Councillor Null?
Yes, I'd like to get the engineering staff to explain what the surplus could be used for.
Well, currently we carry every year a $50,000 contingency in the budget, which I don't think has ever been spent. And it has a tendency to encourage sloppy budgeting because you've got a $50,000 cushion there before your budget actually goes over. So it might make more sense to use, say, $100,000 of this surplus to create a sewer operating reserve and never have a contingency, because the 100,000 acts as a permanent contingency, and then use the other 150,000 to lower rates over the next 2015, 2016, and 2017. That's just a suggestion how to allot that.
Councillor Day?
Thanks. Being as this is generated by a user fee, would there be, I'm trying to think of what the acceptable uses for the money are, and what I really don't want to see happen is I don't want to see the user fee rate be so changed downward, because we get into a vicious cycle of zigzagging up and down, and it's very, very hard on people when their bill is higher the next year. So, I'd rather keep the bill the same and catch up to it somehow, but I would assume that there are pardon me, parts that wear out that are considered normal wear and tear within a sewer system, pumps, things that have to eventually be replaced. If that were the case, then it would make sense to maybe put it in a reserve fund. Or is there possibly a capital investment that would be to the benefit of the whole sewer system in some way?
The capital investment idea I'd leave to the Director of Finance to comment on. But as for normal wear and tear on pumps and things like that, we do have a budget for each pump station, which takes care of normal annual expenditures in that regard. Where we have a special problem, as we had with Wilfred, last year we went over budget on Wilfred pump station, but we went under on the others in compensation. And for this year, we specifically budgeted, for 2014, we specifically budgeted the correct amount to correct that problem with Wilfred, because we were forewarned by the issues we had the year before.
Mayor Hamilton?
And I just want to go back to an email that I received from one of our residents that in that section says, as a resident paying the sewer fee, I don't want any transfer to reserves, and all the previous transfers not spent on sewer costs returned to the sewer revenue to reduce my annual fee. So that's coming from somebody who is seeing that on there.
I believe that the person is objecting transfer to reserves that aren't to do with the expenditure that is fee would normally be spent on. If we create a sewer operating reserve, it can only be spent to essentially prevent a spike in the fees 1 year because of a particular problem. And it does allow us to get rid of that $50,000 contingency, which right now is being budgeted into the sewer fees every year.
So it would, in effect, sorry if I can jump in there, lower the user fee by the $50,000, whatever the individual impact is, I'm not sure. So it would lower the fees but create a reserve fund. But I just wondered if I could also get an answer from finance about whether or not it could be used for capital infrastructure. And one of the things I'm thinking about is future need for things like attenuation in lines that are oversubscribed.
If I may jump in here, the intent of the sewer user fee is to cover operating and maintenance costs. So with respect to establishing a reserve fund specifically for sewer operating, that fee is still being used as intended, and just like the city engineer said, it would prevent any future spikes. With respect to a capital reserve, or for using it to contribute to the sewer fleet reserve, that's not directly using the fee as its intended purpose. our recommendation is really to consider putting it towards a sewer operating reserve fund. And currently the budget is proposing a lower user fee. We have taken out the component of the budget related to, we'd been budgeting a relatively healthy amount, between $75,000 and $100,000 for legal costs, because in past years we had incurred quite high legal costs, and in the last 2-3 years we really haven't at all. So we have removed that component. Now the contingency line item, the $50,000, that is included in the proposed plan before you, but one idea there could be, rather than having it as a contingency, have it as a transfer to the sewer operating reserve. Or you could remove that in its entirety as well, and that would slightly lower your fee as well, something to consider.
Any further questions? Councillor Nault?
Thank you. I think I'm the only one on council that's actually paying for sewers right now. And I would like to see the user fees stay as low as possible. I do note, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're going from 758,000 collected in 2014 to 574 in 2015. That's about a 33% reduction over last year for the average user. I like to see that, and I see they're kept relatively low for the remainder of the years in the forecast. I would like to see that money transferred to a operating reserve fund, and we could get rid of the line for the contingency fund at that point. We could probably reduce the sewer user fee even a little bit more, so that would be my preference.
Any further comments or questions? Councillor Day?
Just, and it's kind of, I guess I'm more than anything, I don't know if it can be answered tonight, but I do flag the issue because it isn't quite as linear as we might like to think that sewers are, in that there are some lines that I know that we're aware are going to, once a number of projects come online, they're going to be very tight for their capacity, and one of the suggestions that has been made has been to have attenuation tanks in the line, so to handle peak flow issues, and how that might be afforded. And I don't really know how to tackle that, except that I know that it's a complicated system that probably is going to have some bumps somewhere along the line in terms of being able to pay for that system, and it might be 5 years from now, I don't know, but I just flag that as an issue, and I don't know, maybe engineering has some ideas on that.
Michael?
That's a capacity issue, and the sewer enhancement fee is designed to raise the money we need to address capacity issues. We actually have about 10 years before we expect any significant capacity issues to arise, and by that time the fees and DCCs should have accumulated enough to deal with them quite easily.
Any further questions? Are we finished with this particular item?
Did we get a motion on what council would like us to do with potential surplus? I think that's what we're looking for, is some direction on that.
Madam Chair, I think Jason has a motion for you.
Thank you. Yes, I would be happy to make that motion that the 2014 operating surplus be placed in an operating reserve, and that the contingency, 50,000 I believe it was, be cut from the budget, and the user fees would then be adjusted to reflect that. So that would be my motion. Is that clear? Well, if we reduce the user fee by the $50,000 in contingencies, we can lower the user fees as reflected over the future years.
All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. The next item on the agenda is a report from our Director of Finance. And there are a number of recommendation or directions, actions requested for the committee to make to council on this report. If council or committee could be apprised of that, and I'll turn it over to the Director of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to give you just a brief background. When we were attempting to get the agenda out for our deadline on Thursday at 1 o'clock, my entire finance workbook evaporated. And fortunately, we had done a backup 2 days prior, but I had to go back and reconstruct the entire workbook. The IT gurus at Langford were unable to determine where it went, why it went, so I do apologize on behalf of the computer system, but it did put a bit of a glitch in things, which is why I have handed out to you today a report which will give you some explanation of the budget summary. So I'm going to be walking you through that, and I also have some notes. So I'm pleased to report that I believe that we have made serious progress on putting together a financial plan that reduces the original tax lift that had come in at 9.2% down to 4.9% for the current year. So I'm on page 1 of your budget summary right now. And you might want to have that memorandum I've handed out to you handy, because I'm going to be going through that. So the budget summary as presented at your February 25th meeting showed a 9.2% tax lift for 15, 5.8 for 16, 5.9 for 17, and then we were kind of all over the map, 2.2 for 18 and 0 for 19. So staff have subsequently had some time to go in. We've worked together as a group to determine how we were going to make some trimming and perhaps find some additional revenue. And you can see that we now have, I believe, some tax increases that are much more workable and explainable in terms of how we've arrived at them. We have used 2% as the absolute basic level that we need for taxes. We have added a 1% amount on top of that to fund an infrastructure reserve, and going forward you'll see where that has been put aside. And the remaining 1.9 isn't really a lot of money when a 1% tax lift gives us $115,000. And I've just given you one example there that the RCMP contract increase alone was $186,000, just to give you an idea of some of the things. That's a real big one, and that's beyond our control. So these changes were accomplished by doing a number of things. And if you look at the note 1 that's attached, I've actually given you a bit of a breakdown for those who are curious as to how we went from 9.2% down to 4.9%. So that's this explanatory note that's attached. And at the very bottom, you'll see a bit of math there. I tried to keep it as simple as I could. But last year, our taxes were budgeted for $11.469 million and change. This year, if we are looking to increase that by 4.9%, our tax revenues would go to $12 million. And so when we looked at that, it was how are we going to get to 4.9? So we started to comb through the budget. So we have the first item there for $150,000, and we have explained that is in the past we've historically budgeted $300,000 on purpose to generate a surplus that would go into a reserve for some future paving. Now our actual costs in this account have been running between $50,000 and $150,000. So due to some of the financial pressures we're under this year, we have reduced that budget from $300,000 down to $150,000, still leaving enough for this year's current needs. It will not add to the surplus for this year. The next item that we trimmed, we did find a number of contingencies throughout the budget, and in some ways it's almost tracking these things in duplicate because we also have a reserve for future expenditures in the amount of 1.2 million, and therefore in discussions with engineering and public works staff, it was decided that we didn't need this additional contingency of 60,000. It has been there for 5 years, and we haven't touched it in that time period. Another item which I referred to earlier tonight was I felt I'd been too conservative in terms of my federal PILT payments, and so I have increased that, again being very conservative, up to $2 million, considering we collected just under that last year. We sat down and had a look at any of our projects that we knew for sure were going to go ahead, and our chief building inspector has got specific numbers for us on landmark developments, which again we have the actual figures, and we have increased the building permit budget by 83,000 and change, and the associated plumbing permit budget. And I'll just remind you that when we put together budgets, we do it extremely conservatively so that as new developments come along, and there always will be some, but we haven't counted a lot of those revenues that we don't know about, so that a lot of those will be wins for us down the road. So this is, I much prefer to do this so that when we come back to council, hopefully the surprises are to the positive and not to the negative. But we did have good basis for those additions to revenue. We did trim, we've had several management meetings where, like I mentioned earlier, it was a bit of an auction who could give up some money. And those are some of the items there that, maybe don't seem like a lot, but they do add up. And I appreciate the spirit of cooperation from other team members to reduce budgets in some areas. And I think that's fairly self-explanatory. A couple of the items that did generate a fair bit of council and staff time are two of the smallest items, and that's the grants and honorariums budget increase, which is what you spent a fair bit of time here last week on. So we had to increase the budget by the $1,050 that was approved by council. And we also have added an item for the, I can never remember that acronym, but it's $1,200 for the group with various disabilities, I think it is. And staff did recommend that we remove one special project item, which was a community wellness initiative of $15,000. That one was recommended specifically for a couple reasons, but one was it was funded by taxation. And one of the recommendations I saw come forward from the Economic Development Committee was keep an eye on anything that was specifically funded from taxation. And I also have put in there a trim on the RCMP overtime, as mentioned earlier. There were some other things we did, pluses and minuses, but I wanted to give you just a rough idea of how the tax total revenue figure, we were able to decrease it from the proposed 9.2% lift. If you were to go back and look at your budget summary from February 25, that's how we got to that difference. So I'm just going to take a pause after note 1. And the other important thing I want you to keep in mind is that these changes have been accomplished by doing these trims, adding, but it does include the payroll supplementals. So in your budget binder, we do have those payroll supplementals, and you haven't looked at them for a while, so they are in section 2 of your binder at the very end of that. And in there, I think it's about $87,000 for your salary costs plus some benefit costs for about $115,000 or so. That's for 2015. We have managed to include those 2 positions which are budgeted for half-time in 2015, and we have also included them for full-time in 2016. So we have managed to fold those into the budget. So at this point, I was going to pause to see if council would like to give us some direction, because first of all, as staff, we've come up with some ideas here on where we think we can live with the tax increase, and you have one of 2 ways you can handle this. You can let me go through the full report, and then you can come back and make some motions, but I would like some direction. So on this point in particular, I'd like some direction from council what you would like to see for tax increases, and the second point is the supplemental costs.
Any questions from committee members? Councillor Day?
Thanks. Just So make sure that I get all my ducks in a row more than anything else. In your note, it says that PILT in 2014 was $1,982,000. In my actuals for 2014 for PILT, I have $2,170,174 in the spreadsheet that was included with the agenda package. So I'm just
your actuals, right? Is that what you said?
that's the actual.
Yeah, because there's a number of components that make up PILT. So the main, when I say PILT, I'm sorry, I shortcut a bit. The main component there is what we get from the federal government. So in the follow-up to the budget meetings note where I list the different PILT amounts, you'll notice that in addition to that 1.9 million, the actual amount we got from the federal government, there's some other smaller amounts that add up there to give you that larger actual number.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I was just focusing on the incremental change that I made to Councillor Day to that one big payment we get from the federal government,
Okay.
which definitely can be increased by $100,000 in my opinion.
And there was just one other line when I was reading through the agenda package that I didn't understand, and that was the gains on capital assets and MFA actuarials, which appeared to be budgeted for just over 100,000 and actually seemed to come in at like 30,000.
Jen?
With respect to the budget, the 2014 budget did include the actuarial revenue. We've excluded that from the 2015 to the 2019 budget. And prior to 2014, we had never included that in the budget because it is non-cash. In terms of the 2014 actual, that $29,000 does represent a gain on the sale of, I believe it was 3 pieces of our fleet. And we will be booking an actuarial adjustment, so the actual will be in line with the budget. But again, we typically don't budget for the actuarial adjustment revenue. And we don't usually budget for any gains on disposals of assets because it's very difficult to judge whether or not we will seek anything.
So just if I can make sure I understand, the actuarial is a benefit of a reduced amount that we have to pay back to MFA?
Exactly. And if you were to include it in your financial plan, you would really have to increase your debt principal payments. The MFA acknowledges the fact that we're earning this revenue, and our payments that we make, whether they're monthly or annually, are reduced by that amount. So a much more straightforward way for us to budget is to simply budget the actual debt payments that are made per the amortization schedules, which acknowledge this so-called revenue that we're earning.
Mayor Hamilton?
The only note on that sheet that we just went through, Andrea, would be the Community Wellness Initiative project that we have there. Councillor Robb is not here to speak to that, and he probably has more information and question on that. Is there a way to kind of hold that to a point where he can speak to it, or that would happen at council?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm looking to our communications manager, actually, Sandra. Can you add anything? Because I don't know that much about the project.
Sure. So what I know about this project is this would be seed money to start a community wellness initiative here in the city that would do an analysis of targeted services and key players in this, identify project funding, so apply for grants, solicit support of community education, health, and medical community, and business support. It would include a proposal to Royal Roads University to design and implement a new program that would feed into our community initiative, and then detailed and specific actions targeting our neighborhoods, preschool, elementary, and business. So business wellness initiatives, free public wellness clinics, conferences, and facilities. And I think with a view to getting a large grant to build a facility, a wellness and sport facility here in Colwood. That's the vision for this initiative that Councillor Martin brought forward, and has a somebody from PICE, Pacific Institute of Sport Excellence, who is working with Royal Roads and has the support of Royal Roads on this project. That's what I know about this initiative.
Mayor Hamilton?
And further to that, I have a letter from Royal Roads University that basically says that they're very supportive in the regards to the possible development of this coming forward. Just trying to quickly read through this for. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure if that was distributed to all of council, but it was just received on March the 9th.
Andrea?
With regard to the letter specifically, I don't believe anyone else has seen it. I was just asking our Director of Administration. Okay. Okay, so maybe what we could do with that specific question, because the next item actually does deal with special projects, which is where this item is. You may want to include a notation about that in any motion you might want to make. Mayor Hamilton? You might want to, see, the next item we're going to be getting to is special projects. And this particular item, this $15,000 item, is a special project that staff was recommending that we delete, and you could maybe speak to that when we pass a motion at that topic.
Can I just ask what the impact would be to taxation to include it in this year?
Basically, it's $15,000. It's 1/10 of a 1% increase. So 1% is 115,000. Sorry, not quite. A little bit more than that.
So that would take us up to a 5% tax
little bit
lift
over,
instead of
Yeah.
slightly over 5%?
Yeah. Unless council can suggest some other areas to make up for it. Then. The difficulty we had in going through our special projects and our tangible capital assets is most of those projects are not funded by taxation. They're actually funded by either gas tax or other reserve funds, so it wasn't going to be a direct savings on the tax lift.
I just have, I forgot to ask, it's highlighted on my sheet. I was trying to understand under, on the 2015 to 2019 financial plan that was included in our agenda package, at the bottom where it says total revenue, there are percentages underneath.
Yep.
I didn't quite understand what those percentages were trying to explain.
Okay, so we did have a look at that the first time this was presented, and it is a little bit hard to understand when you see a revenue decrease. Perhaps that might be confusing of 5%. And one of the reasons for that is that we did include Solar Colwood in-kind contributions as revenue in the 2014 budget, and we have removed that this year to the tune of about $1.1 million because, you know, it's kind of like you can't spend what you don't actually have. So this was not actual cash. This was in-kind. So it does skew the total revenue figures. And then I'm almost thinking of removing these in some ways because the problem is when we have some big swings in things like, I'm just looking here at this 12%, if we increase our sewer, if we levy a new parcel tax, for instance, okay, do you see right near the bottom of page 1, your sewer revenue goes from 1.1 to 1.4. Well, that triggers a big change in your revenues, and that's because of the Colwood Central. And we've now incurred some more debt there, and we've also created a new parcel tax to pay for it. So that gives you a big swing in your revenue of 12%. That's the biggest change there. I'd like to say we were finding awesome new sources in building permit revenues. We're going through the roof, but we've been pretty conservative in those areas.
Any further comments or questions with respect to the first part of this report? Did committee wish to make a recommendation at this time?
Madam Chair, I'd like to go through the special projects before we make a recommendation on the whole budget. I just feel like if we haven't talked about the special projects, it's hard to make a recommendation on the whole big picture when you still have something left to talk about.
Okay, and with that in mind, you may want me to go through the whole thing because it does all tie together, right? So that's note 1. So if we could move on then to note 2. And I have handed out to you a slightly revised schedule. Not any real big changes in terms of the total money that we're recommending for expenditure, but I have given you a bit of a breakdown for those of you who want to know exactly what's changed. I have laid it out for you there. So as you know, we did do a bit of a last-minute addition of the pergolas, okay? I always want to say pergolas, I'm not sure, for $25,800. We did, as we've already mentioned, we were looking at deleting the $15,000 for the wellness initiative. There was $12,000 in there for a pump upgrade that we realized didn't need to be there. And at this point, in the interest of trying to keep the budget down, we'd also had an engineering office upgrade, which I was hoping we would remove for now because we will be getting a seismic report, which may completely dictate a whole new look at how we structure this office, or even if we use the office. So a lot of these things I'd like to just make mention of in the 5-year plan. The first year is the most accurate year we can get when we do this. The next year is fairly accurate, and then beyond that, honestly, it's often our best guess. And this is a 5-year. It's a living document, and we do revise it every year. So our crystal balls just get kind of fuzzy when we get out into years 3, 4, and 5 of it. So I don't really have any further comments there because the changes have been actually pretty minor there.
Any questions from committee? No, we'll carry on. Councillor?
Sorry, I'm slow. I was just trying to figure out where we were. I just am looking at the deletion of the $21,100 engineering office upgrade pending the seismic report. And I wasn't sure that we had decided to go through with the seismic report, so maybe can you remind me where we're at with that?
Well, that is still on your listing here this evening, the seismic. We have not received direction from council to remove the seismic. I think the concern we have is that we shouldn't look at one area in isolation. Like we should, if we're going to be doing renovations of the building, that we would look at the whole building and at that point in time pull together a coordinated approach, because I'm sure there'll be other things that may need to be done, especially if we're looking at creating a couple of new positions here too. We might be doing a fair bit of reorganizing.
Any further comments or questions?
Okay, so I'll go on then to note 3. I don't want to be rushing anyone. I was going to hand this out, but we made such a minor change to the tangible capital assets that I haven't. Basically, if you look in your budget binder, I think it's tab 4 where your tangible capital asset sheet is. Necessity has intervened here. We had initially hoped to budget $50,840 for SharePoint implementation, actually to complete it, because we do have SharePoint now in some of our departments, specifically planning, and we're hoping to roll it out to our other departments. And so what I'd like to do is move $25,000 of that budgeted amount into 2015 so we can carry on with our training and rolling out that file management program to our engineering department. So the total dollars budgeted haven't changed at all. We've just changed the timing a little bit. So that was just a note for your reference.
Any questions from committee on this matter?
Okay. All right, so we'll go on then to note 4. In your budget summary now, we're just gonna kind of walk through the budget summary, and we'll get to the transfers to and from reserves. So basically, page 1, I think we've had a pretty good look at that. We did have a look at it earlier at the February 25th meeting. First page is your revenues. The second page is basically your operating expenses by department. And I believe that your managers have actually been quite prudent in terms of their budgeting in this year and going forward into next year. And like I say, when we get more than a couple years out, it's often more difficult, and we will be revising those next year when we look at the 5-year picture, right?
Sorry, just what page are you looking at right now?
I'm on page 18 of your agenda package and page 2 of the budget summary, which is operating expenses. Yep. Yeah.
Not the big one?
Not the big one. No, I'm back on your budget summary.
Went to second page.
So there's a 6-page financial plan there, Councillor Day. We're on
Okay.
page 2 of that.
Okay.
I'm just
Okay.
kind of looking at the
Yeah.
overview. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So within that, page 2, I'm just pointing out we've, I think, been pretty prudent there in terms of no huge big swings in the different departments. Page 3 is just a bit of a graphic. And page 4 is where your special projects, it's kind of nice if you can see how these things hook together just a little bit. So the special projects, that big sheet, the special project sheet on this page of the summary, you'll see the totals come in there. And then on page 5, one of the things I wanted to point out is some other unusual items. So when we take on new debt, you'll see that coming in as an addition on this page, and then it very quickly goes back out to buy the asset. But there's some figures there I wanted to spend a bit of time with you on this evening, because I don't know if this has been done before, and I think it's really important that council and staff understand the transfers from reserves and the transfers to reserves, because I had a hard look at what had been done last year, and I was a little bit concerned because it looked like some expenditures had been funded in the operating side from taking money out of reserves, and you don't normally fund operating expenses from your reserves. That's what you use your capital monies for. So it's just a little bit of me trying to assist council in knowing what are the right questions to ask when you look at these budgets. And that's why we have note 4, which gives an analysis of those figures. So in 2015, from reserves, we're going to be pulling out $1,075,000 and change, and a little bit less, and then it trails off, because what we find is people are usually pretty good at figuring out what they need to spend in the short term on their special projects in particular, and that's why we don't see a lot going forward. I'm going to go to the last page now of the financial plan, and in here you see some specific deductions. So when we are making payments on our debt, there's a line called principal payments on debt, and the next line is your transfers to reserves. And again, those figures we're going to look at in detail, because I want you to understand where it is we're actually trying to specifically save some money and what it's going to pay for. And the remaining figures there, all those figures tie to your tangible capital assets. The big sheet, almost right at the very bottom, you'll see a figure, total acquisition of tangible capital assets. All those numbers tie in to that big sheet you've got, the tangible capital asset sheet. So if any of you are just wondering where these numbers come from, that's kind of a bit of a check and balance on where the money flows. So I would like to just get you to turn now to the detailed analysis of our transfers to and from reserves, which is the last page of the handout I've given you this evening. And the top section is money that we are taking out of our reserves basically to pay for things like our special projects and our tangible capital assets. And that totals $1,075,000, and over the next few years, our total transfers from reserves are $1.5 million. Below that is where we're trying to put money back into our reserves, and the total over the next 5 years is 3.4. So the net increase that we're budgeting for at this time is 1.9. That is conservative. I actually expect it will wind up being quite a bit higher than that, but that's what's in your budget this evening. Now, things that we can't budget for, but we know we will be getting some money for, are from our developers when they're asked to, when a development goes ahead, and I've reviewed this with our planner, we receive things like amenity contributions, for example, and those do increase our reserves. And we were looking at between amenity, and there's one other category here, affordable housing. We're looking at well over $100,000 each year. So there's some of those things, but they're not actually directly something we budget for. But I can give you some assurance that there are some additional monies that we know will be coming in for these things. So the transfers to reserves, which is the bottom half of this schedule, these are things taken from you have a fleet replacement schedule, which I've had a look at. We weren't able to fully fund it for 2015 and 2016 because in order to keep the budget, the tax lift down to those percentages I talked about right away, one of the things is that in the short term, I cannot put the same amount of money back into the reserves that I would like to in order to keep the tax lift at a rate that I think is affordable. When I looked at your last year's financial plan, you were hoping a net increase of reserves of about $800,000 more. Right now I'm at 1.9, but I'm being extremely conservative, and I do believe that when we start to look at some of the development that is projected for Colwood, that will improve. I have not been overly optimistic on our tax revenues. I did not take your tax base and go, well, you know, I think we're going to have a whole bunch of new developments that will increase your tax base by pick a number. I have not done that. I have taken your actual revenue collected last year and added some percentages. You may be wondering, as a homeowner, well, what is my tax bill going to look like this coming year? I would be wondering that. That isn't as easy to answer as it should be because it depends on your assessed value. So let's say the assessed value on your house, in general, our residential houses, the values went down about 1% this year, but we did have some new construction that added to our base, and that's helpful. That's like new tax money that comes in, but it's tough to estimate. We also had some increases in our business and our other non-residential categories. So if your assessed value on your house went up by 10% when everybody else's went down by 1%, let's say, then your tax bill is probably going to be quite a bit higher than your neighbors, right? Like maybe you put an addition on your house, or the tax man's up there now spying with satellites, and they've got pictures of everything, and they notice you've built a new shed in your yard or something. You know, if you've made some improvements, taken out a building permit, put a new suite in, whatever, that will drive a higher tax bill, right? Because your assessed value has gone up higher than comparable properties. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'm doing my best because people will say, what's that going to look like on the average bill? We will be getting our final assessment roll at the end of this month, which is helpful because we have a number of properties under appeal, and that will give us the final numbers on which to run our tax rates. So I had to get in a bit of an analysis on that because that's important. You know, as councillors, representative of your community, you often get these questions, right? So back to where we're trying to save some money and tuck it away. On here you'll see a transfer to the infrastructure deficit reserve. Those figures there are very specific, and they equal exactly 1% of the total tax amounts that we're suggesting would be raised with those various increases that I talked about this evening. And that money basically is a good start, but it's certainly never enough towards some of the infrastructure deficits. But at least it starts to address the formula that Councillor Day raised, which is how do we know and how do we plan to put money into reserves. And really the number one challenge we have is going forward. We're in a bit of a budget hole this year. I've talked about some of the issues that we've inherited that weren't budgeted for last year, so we've been trying to overcome those, but we can't fix it all in 1 year. So my suggestion is we put less in reserves this year than we would like to see, but going forward we start to increase that level of contribution, which you can see there. A couple of other things to note. There's two items there. The transfer to the sewer general surplus, that money is coming in from your, help me here, Jen, one is your enhancement fees.
The budgeted enhancement fee revenue.
Yeah. And the transfer to the sewer capital reserve is the...
Sorry, the sewer capital reserve is the budgeted enhancement fee revenue.
Yeah.
The sewer general surplus, the city has been paying debt interest on the central area. We haven't yet levied for that area, so we've just been funding that, and we will recover that funding once we start the central parcel taxation next year, hopefully.
So a couple of those items basically are specifically related to our sewer funds. And I was listening to your discussion about the user fees not getting too involved because Jen has been the lead on that, but definitely important to be thinking about continuing to add, in my opinion, to some of your sewer capital reserves, especially if we're looking at some other costs. There's a fair bit of information here which you may not have seen before, and I don't mean to burden you with detail, but this is important. This is kind of like at home, you know, you might decide, okay, we've got all the bills paid, now we've got some money left over. Where are we going to put it for savings? And one of the items in particular I wanted to draw your attention to was the fire fleet replacement. That's quite a large number there. And the reason for that is we did draw down the fire fleet replacement reserve in 2014. If you recall, the new snorkel truck came in considerably over budget, so we had to take that difference from the fire fleet reserve. And we also have another some other equipment that we're planning on buying right now. One piece is in 2017, and Joanne, I don't quite know the name of it if it's a new fire truck, but it's like 800-some thousand. At the current time, we're thinking we might pay for it with debt, but honestly, if we can avoid doing that and start to build our reserves up, we're far better off than incurring debt, because we will need our debt capacity going forward, potentially for sewer treatment costs. That's going to be a big strain on how much money we can actually borrow. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some ideas there. Any questions on that?
Yes, you said 2017 we can expect to pay for a new fire vehicle, but you show no transfer from the fleet fire replacement in 2017?
No, and the reason for that is right now it is showing as being funded from debt, and I'm kind of thinking ahead of that. I'm hoping that we can actually not have to borrow that money, that debt for the new fire truck, and actually take it from fleet replacement.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Day?
Thanks. Just for the fire fleet replacement, it does go down by $10,000 between 2016 and 2017. Is that a smaller vehicle, or it goes from 210.3 to 209?
Oh, that's no. How can I explain that? Basically, once we've sort of paid all the bills in the operating side, I look at what money was left over to put away into our reserves, and I did kind of a pro rate there in 2017. You'll see that 2018, I know we're hoping to replace the vehicle in 2017, and we will have enough money in there in 2017, but we'll have really drawn that reserve down if we pay the whole $800,000. And in 2018, you'll see the 391, which is a much bigger number. I'm trying to replace some of the money that we've just taken out of there in 2017 to buy the new equipment. And I believe there's some other equipment as well.
And sorry, just staying with that line item, it bumps up significantly in 2019 to $628,000.
Yeah, now, again, I would caution you because we're now 5 years out. The crystal ball here is a bit fuzzy. And I would say we'll have a better idea next year. Once we get through, I think what is a bit of a difficult year, like we really need to be fiscally prudent in 2015 and 16. And it may well be that Council, we'll have a closer look at our reserves and go, you know, where we actually need them is more in our capital reserve or whatever. Because right now, we're not seeing a lot of major, really other projects. If you look in that top section, I don't see a lot of demand here from our reserves in the top section. But that doesn't mean there won't be demand. It just means that people haven't, you know, beyond the first couple of years, got a really clear picture of where that money is required from.
I was just wondering because my recollection of the tax rates was that it was fairly consistent in the last 3 years at a relatively low percentage increase. And I just wondered how the reserve fund in 1 year went up by like, you know, $200 and some thousand.
Well, basically, we are, I hope, we're going to be tightening up all the way across in terms of our expenditures, because you'll notice that the total department increases are between 1.5% and 2% when you look at your total expenditures on the budget summary. And that is one of the things driving it. We do have some additional revenues coming in, whether it's through building permits and some of the developments, but very conservative figures. Like, I hope we're actually building some wins in there that will actually have higher numbers than what we've budgeted for.
Any further questions? Does the committee have any recommendations coming forward for council?
I'd like to move that we keep the $15,000 community wellness initiative in the budget, at least for now. We could take it out at a later date if we don't have a better sense of it. It's very hard to add it in later. That's my suggestion at this point in time.
Any comments or questions on that? And have a vote? Is that a recommendation? Everybody approve? Opposed? Motion carried. Any further recommendations coming forward?
I'd like to move that we, I need help with the wording, that we approve, is approve the word? Or no, recommend to council. That that we accept the, is it that we accept the projections, or that we, sorry, I need help
Which
with
topic
wording.
might you be on? Is it the tax rates or?
Tax rates, yes.
So you would like to recommend approval of the tax rates as?
Well,
presented?
there's a slight adjustment
There'll be a slight adjustment
to
to this
2015 to this year. It'll be 5.
Unless we can find 15,000 to. I'd prefer to try and find the 15 to trim from somewhere else if we can.
Okay. So my motion would be that we set the tax rates at, I'll just say 5% for 2015, 3.9 for 2016, 3.5 for 2017, 3 for 2018, and 3 for 2019.
A vote on that? All approved? Opposed? Motion carried.
So I just, feedback from council I think would be appreciated in terms of whether you would like finance staff to try to find the money to trim that down to the 4.9%, or I think it's a small investment and hundreds of dollars per hour trying to figure it all out, but I think it's better to have a little leeway than to be too tight in our budget and have our hands tied further down the road.
Any other comments? Mayor Hamilton?
Yeah, I agree that, it seems to be a fairly insignificant amount of money, and I know that I had conversation this afternoon with our communications director around, possibilities of finding some way to cost share that opportunity so that we don't lose it in its entirety. So, again, without Councillor Martin here, who had sort of the background on it, I thank Council for keeping it in for now, and if we can find a place that we can nip and tuck along the way to make sure it happens, I think we'll also be looking outside for a possibility to share that and keep costs down for Council too.
Okay, so we've talked about the tax lift, which, by the way, does drive pretty much what's left over to put into our reserves, okay? So is Council fine with the special projects and the TCA list, other than the one item you've noted as being added back to special projects? That was the 15,000 wellness initiative. The tangible capital asset list, would be nice if we actually had a motion from Council approving that.
Sorry, I just keep finding myself getting lost in which piece of paper we're looking at.
I believe it's tab 4.
I didn't bring my big binder is probably my problem.
Oh,
Is
okay.
it in this memorandum, the tangible
No,
capital?
but I can give you a copy. I have one right here.
Just looking at the list that was just provided to me, if I may, Madam Chair. The reserve fund for St. John's Church appears to not have a balance.
Yes, it has a balance. This is just recording funding sources to pay for the different projects on this list. So there wasn't any...
It's reporting that nothing was taken from that fund.
That's right.
Okay.
Basically, when we list all these projects, we like to give Council an idea of where the money's coming from to pay for them, because all of those figures then tie into the transfers to and from reserves that we covered earlier, a little while ago.
ask a question just on one item that's on the list? It's the Painter Road pedestrian and bike connection from gas tax.
$155,000 for 2016. Right? Okay. I will have to defer to our engineer on that one. I don't know. Painter Road pedestrian and bike connection. Any ideas?
Gonna need clarification on,
Okay. Otherwise, we'll look it up in your engineering budget here.
yeah.
Or do we have it? Yes, we don't.
Oh, Painter Road. Okay, yeah, that's to connect Painter Road with the high school with a pedestrian and bike trail.
Yeah, so at least for myself, that's a project I won't be supporting. I'm sorry, but it's just where I'm at. I just went and had a look at it the other day. I don't think it's doable. Certainly not $155,000.
Well,
It's
we
very
wouldn't be doing it on the property, just the work off the property. The developer would do it on the property. The developer, what we're trying to get is to get the developer to do the work on his property, and we would do the work off the property. But if we don't do it, then it's not, for kids to walk or bike to school, they've got to go down the chosen road, or possibly Wishart and around through Royal Bay.
If I could also provide some clarity, the funding on that is not coming from taxation. It is coming from gas tax. So, and it is definitely eligible for that. So it's not going to be a real direct impact to the taxpayer.
No, unfortunately, though, it'll be a very direct impact to the neighborhood, and it's a project that I'm opposed to. So just on principle, I can't vote for it as part of a package of projects when I don't agree with the project.
Any further comments or questions, staff or committee?
Well, I just wonder then if the rest of council would like to vote on that. Like, would you like it removed from the list? That, we should maybe hear from what the rest of council thinks.
Councillor Null?
Yes, given that that is a 2016 expenditure, I believe we could leave that for another year. I am actually in favor of that. That provides a very necessary access to the new high school and that neighborhood. Barring that, they're going to have to go all the way out to Latoria Road or out to Machosen Road to get there. So given that the developer will be paying for the lion's share of that, and given that this is one of the structures in our transportation master plan, I will be supporting that. I will not support removing it.
Any further comments?
I'd just like to make sure that everybody's clear that this is bikes and peds only. It's not designed for cars. It, in fact, would have to be a switchback to go down that slope.
So I don't know if council's noticed, but we've actually brought up some background on this, and I think we actually have a diagram of it. I'm not sure, over to our Director of Engineering, if this is helpful, but this was one of the backup documents that we have for this.
If they come biking down here,
Councillor Day?
Thanks. I will leave it in there since it's 2016, and we can argue about it some more later. My issue is that it's proposed in the Transportation Master Plan for transit, and considerable. I like that. That looks good in the Transportation Master Plan. There's no bike lanes on Painter Road in front of Dunsmuir School. So there's work to be done in the area, but it's a ways out, so we could figure it out.
Any further comments or questions? Andrea?
Could we possibly have a motion then approving the tangible capital asset projects for the 5 years?
Comments or questions on the motion? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried.
Okay, so I basically believe we've gone through some of the toughest part of the budget, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming to all these meetings, and to staff. We'll see if we can trim $15,000. I did have a provisional meeting scheduled if we needed it for Tuesday the 31st. I don't believe we're going to need it unless I hear further objections from council that they need to have a couple more budget meetings just to kind of keep us tuned up here. I would like to actually bring this forward for first, second, and third reading at a council meeting unless further discussion is required. So I will leave that up to council to let me know what your next steps would be with this.
Would is it the committee's desire to have another meeting with regard to budget, or have the Director of Finance proceed with the bylaws? Councillor Day?
I was just going to mime putting a gun to our heads, but we need another meeting. No, I feel that we're pretty complete on our financial plan, and that we're ready to bring this forward to council. So I would recommend that to council that and how you word that you recommend to council that they recommend that finance bring forward a bylaw for 3 readings.
Yeah, well, we will bring it back, you know, and if we have a bit of time, we might even do a bit of a PowerPoint to explain some of the other changes. But you've agreed to the basic principles this evening. Thank you very much. I will do my best to see if we can't trim another 15,000 and leave in that one special project you talked about. And then we can move forward onto some other topics. Thank you very much.
Move adjournment? All in favor? Motion carried.
Yeah, they often bring them into the chamber. Shouldn't be allowed. I don't think. Gun-free zone. Psychological resilience.